There's a story the WNBA didn't want you to hear. Not a rumor circulating on Reddit, not a hot take from a hot sports radio host with an axe to grind. A credentialed, veteran journalist, the kind with real sources inside real buildings, sat down, made her calls, and published something that sent shockwaves through the front offices of women's basketball. And the league's response? Deny everything, address nothing, and hope the news cycle moves on before too many people notice. It won't. Because what's been uncovered here isn't just about one player, one investigation, or one leaked message. It's about a professional sports league actively working against the single greatest thing that has ever happened to it. And the more you dig into the details, the harder it becomes to look away. Let's start from the beginning, because the full picture is wilder than anything you've seen in a highlight reel. It was supposed to be just another regular season game. The Indiana Fever hosting the Golden State Valkyries, a matchup that, on paper, didn't carry the weight of a playoff series or a championship moment. But by the time the final buzzer sounded, Caitlin Clark had turned it into something else entirely. 35 points, a triple-double, 11 records shattered in a single night. The Fever didn't just win, they dismantled the Valkyries in a way that left analysts scrambling for historical comparisons. It was the kind of performance that belongs in a time capsule, the kind that gets replayed on ESPN for years and debated in barbershops long after the season ends. For any other player in any other league, that night would have been the beginning of a 2-week celebration cycle. Magazine covers, award nominations, glowing feature pieces, the full treatment. Instead, the WNBA opened an investigation. Not into anything Clark did wrong, not into a flagrant foul or an on-court altercation. The league announced it was looking into alleged racial remarks made by fans inside the arena during the game. And here's the part that should make your jaw drop. The entire basis for this investigation wasn't video footage, it wasn't audio recordings, it wasn't witness statements from players, coaches, or arena staff. It was Twitter posts, social media comments from anonymous accounts typed from phones held by people who may or may not have even been in the building that night. Let that sit for a second. A professional sports league in 2025 launched a formal investigation into what happened inside a basketball arena, and the only evidence they had was a collection of tweets. Natalie Atchin, the head coach of the Golden State Valkyries, the team that just got embarrassed by 35 points on that floor, came forward almost immediately. He said he heard nothing improper from the crowd that night. No racial language, nothing that crossed a line, nothing that stood out from the standard intensity of a playoff atmosphere regular season game. The man had every reason in the world to stay quiet or even quietly validate the narrative if it helped his team in some way. Instead, he walked directly into the spotlight and told the truth. Loud crowd, enthusiastic fans, completely normal basketball environment. Full stop. Multiple attendees confirmed that a sound effect frequently used in NBA arenas, a well-known audio clip that's been a staple of game night atmosphere in Pacers games for years, had been played through the speakers, something that, when clipped and stripped of context on social media, could be made to sound like something it wasn't. That's it. That was the foundation of the entire investigation. 3 days after announcing the inquiry, the WNBA acknowledged it had no completion timeline. No timeline for an investigation that had no corroborating evidence of any kind. Sources close to the situation told reporter Christine Brennan of USA Today that the league wasn't dragging its feet because the case was complicated. They were dragging their feet because they had nothing, and they were waiting for the next controversy to come along and bury this one before they had to publicly admit it. That's not how legitimate investigations work. That's damage control for a mess of your own making. But why would the league make that mess in the first place? Why would they choose the night of one of the most dominant individual performances in the WNBA history to open an inquiry that had no real foundation? The answer to that question is where this story gets genuinely disturbing. Christine Brennan has been covering sports for USA Today for decades. She is not a blogger.
She is not a content creator chasing clicks. She is a journalist with relationships built over years inside professional sports organizations, the kind of journalist who gets calls returned and documents forwarded in confidence. When she publishes something, it's because she's done the work.
What her sources handed her was a leaked internal message from inside the WNBA league office. And the relevant portion of that message, once it became public, explained a great deal about everything that had been happening to Caitlin Clark since the moment she entered the league. The message read, "Need to find balance in coverage. CC momentum becoming troublesome for league narrative." CC, Caitlin Clark. Her momentum, her popularity, her viewership numbers, her record-breaking performances described internally as troublesome. Sit with that for a moment, because it's extraordinary. This is not a rival team's front office whispering about a competitor. This is the league itself, the organization whose entire purpose is to promote and grow women's professional basketball, describing its most popular and most marketable player as a problem to be managed. A league executive, according to Brennan's reporting, used the word troublesome to describe the momentum of the player who had just attracted more new fans to women's basketball than anyone in the sport's history. Try to imagine the NBA sending an internal memo describing LeBron James' popularity as troublesome. Picture the NFL flagging Patrick Mahomes' momentum as a narrative problem. The very idea is absurd, because in every other context, a dominant, charismatic, record-breaking superstar who brings millions of new eyeballs to the sport is celebrated as a gift. They build marketing campaigns around those athletes. They hand them the keys to the league's image and let them drive. The WNBA looked at Caitlin Clark and apparently saw something to contain. Brennan's reporting went further. The leaked message wasn't an isolated moment of frustration from one overzealous executive. It was part of a broader strategy, a messaging framework that, according to her sources, had been developed weeks before the Fever Valkyries game even took place, weeks before Clark dropped that triple-double and shattered 11 records, before the investigation was announced, before any of the social media noise had started. The framework had a surface-level justification that sounded reasonable. Ensure fair and balanced coverage for all WNBA players. Don't let any single athlete dominate the narrative. In isolation, you could almost read that as responsible league management. But Brennan's sources described what the strategy actually looked like in practice, and it had nothing to do with elevating other players. It was about limiting Clark, specifically, deliberately, regardless of what she did on the court. The plan outlined ways to steer media attention away from Clark-focused stories, ways to contextualize her accomplishments so they wouldn't register as the historic moments they actually were, ways to ensure that no matter how dominant her performance was on any given night, the league's official channels and communications would find something else to amplify instead. And suddenly, a lot of things that had seemed like coincidences started looking like a pattern. Here's what had already happened before Brennan's investigation made any of this public. Go back and look at the timeline, because once you start connecting the dots, the picture that emerges is difficult to dismiss as random. When Caitlin Clark broke the all-time NCAA scoring record, a record that had stood for decades, one of the most celebrated individual achievements in the history of college sports, the WNBA's internal response, according to sources cited by Brennan, was to downplay it. Specifically, league communications were advised to emphasize that Clark had played more games than the previous record holders, framing the accomplishment as something statistical and circumstantial rather than historic. The focus was shifted, the achievement was diminished. The league that should have been celebrating the arrival of a generational talent was quietly working to make her seem less exceptional. Then came the draft. Caitlin Clark's entry into the WNBA drove viewership figures that the league had never seen before, draft night numbers that shattered records, interest from casual sports fans who had never previously engaged with women's basketball, a legitimate mainstream moment for a league that had spent years fighting for mainstream relevance.
The WNBA's marketing response, according to Brennan, was to credit the entire draft class, to make sure that Clark specifically was not framed as the reason for the surge. Not because the draft class wasn't talented, it was, but the framing was deliberate. They didn't want a narrative where one player was responsible for all of this attention, even if that was closer to the reality. Last season, Caitlin became the fastest rookie in the WNBA history to record a triple-double, a historic milestone, the kind of thing that gets pinned to the top of the league's official social media accounts for days. Instead, the league's official channels initially highlighted a completely different statistical accomplishment from another player in that same game. Caitlin's triple-double, her historic first in league history at that speed, was not properly acknowledged until fans pushed back loudly enough that ignoring it became impossible.
At every turn, the response to Caitlin Clark's excellence wasn't amplification, it was management. Quiet, carefully worded, plausibly deniable management. And then there's the officiating. This part of Brennan's investigation is the one that generated the most discomfort, because if true, it represents something that goes beyond bad PR decisions and organizational politics. It reaches into the actual game being played on the court. Brennan's sources included a former referee, someone who had worked inside the professional officiating system and had direct knowledge of how player-specific conversations happen within that structure. And what that source described was something veterans of the sport said they had never encountered before. The context here matters. Every referee in professional basketball understands that officiating isn't perfectly uniform across all players. Stars get certain calls. Rookies have to earn those calls over time. Physical defenders get more latitude than finesse players. These are the unspoken rules of professional officiating, and anyone who has watched sports for more than a few years understands they exist. It's not ideal, but it's the reality of how the game is called. What the former referee told Brennan was different. It wasn't a description of normal veteran versus rookie officiating dynamics. It was a description of a specific, coordinated approach to how one particular player's effectiveness should be managed through officiating decisions. Not just, don't give her star calls yet, but an active discussion about using officiating as a tool to limit her impact on games. I've never heard of a strategy to specifically limit one player's effectiveness or appeal through officiating, the source told Brennan. And that qualifier, I've never heard of this before, carries weight coming from someone who spent years inside a professional officiating system, where unusual things do occasionally happen. Look at what the numbers actually show. In college, Caitlin Clark was among the most fouled players in the country. Guards who drove to the basket the way she did, who created contact the way she did, who operated in the areas of the floor where she operated, they got calls consistently. Across 4 years of college basketball, the officiating of Clark's game tracked with what you'd expect from a player of her style and aggression. Then she entered the NBWA, and something changed. The physicality directed at her, and it has been well documented, filmed from multiple angles, and commented on by former players and analysts, hasn't resulted in the foul calls that the same contact would typically produce, not in isolated instances, but consistently. Defenders have been allowed to use their bodies against her in ways that draw commentary from people who watch this league every night, and yet the whistle stays silent. Is that a natural adjustment period for a rookie entering a more physical, professional environment? Maybe, in part. Is it partly explained by the way stars are traditionally treated differently from non-established players? Also possible. But Brennan's source adds a third explanation, one that, if accurate, is far more troubling than either of those first two, and it fits the pattern. The WNBA, for its part, flatly denied everything. Their official statement described Brennan's reporting as baseless and without merit, standard language, the kind of non-denial denial that organizations use when they want to go on record as disputing something without actually engaging with any of the specific claims being made.
They didn't explain the internal message. They didn't address the messaging strategy. They didn't respond to the officiating allegations with anything other than the word baseless. When your defense is a single adjective, you usually don't have much of a defense. Let's step back from the leaked messages and the officiating allegations for a moment and look at something more straightforward, what Caitlin Clark has actually done for the WNBA in cold numbers without any spin applied in either direction. Her games set new viewership records, not marginal improvements, genuinely historic numbers, the kind that networks use to renegotiate broadcast rights agreements. Television deals for the WNBA have been in discussions, and the leverage the league has in those conversations is directly connected to the audience that shows up for Caitlin Clark. Sellout arenas. The Indiana Fever went from a team that struggled to fill seats to one of the most difficult tickets to get in women's professional sports. Home games, away games, both. When Clark's name appears on the marquee, people come. Merchandise. Her jersey numbers are the kinds of figures that typically belong to the top male athletes in professional sports. Items sell out. Restocks sell out. The pipeline of new Clark-related merchandise from the Fever and from league partners cannot keep pace with demand. Broadcast battles. Television networks are actively competing for the rights to air WNBA games, specifically games that feature Clark. That kind of competition didn't exist before she arrived in the league. It exists now.
And here's the part that the internal messaging strategy apparently didn't account for. The Clark effect isn't contained to Indiana Fever games. Viewership across the entire WNBA is up. Every team, every market. Social media engagement has increased for franchises that Caitlin Clark has never even played for. New fans who show up to watch her play also discover Aja Wilson. They find Breanna Stewart. They start following Sabrina Ionescu, Angel Reese, Kelsey Plum. They become fans of women's basketball, not just fans of one player. The metrics demonstrate this clearly. Rising tide, all boats. It's not a complicated concept. In the history of professional sports, there has never been a credible argument for suppressing the popularity of your most marketable player. Michael Jordan's dominance didn't shrink the NBA, it made it a global institution. Wayne Gretzky's statistical superiority didn't make hockey fans lose interest in other players, it made the entire sport relevant to audiences that had never paid attention before. Serena Williams didn't drain interest in women's tennis, she created it. The logic of suppression doesn't work. It has never worked, and the idea that a league which spent years struggling for attendance, struggling for broadcast deals, struggling for mainstream cultural relevance, would choose the moment of its greatest commercial success to quietly work against the source of that success, it's almost too irrational to fully process. Almost. Unless the motivation isn't commercial at all. Brennan's reporting identifies two distinct theories for why this is happening, both of which, she says, are reflected in conversations with multiple sources inside the league. The first is about competitive balance in coverage. Several league officials, according to her sources, have expressed concern that allowing Clark to become the face of the WNBA risks alienating other players and their fan bases. The fear is that casual fans will identify the league with Clark specifically, and if Clark ever gets injured, retires, or for any reason exits the spotlight, the league loses all of those fans simultaneously. It's the single point of failure argument. Don't put all of your promotional eggs in one basket. In theory, this is the kind of concern a thoughtful sports executive might raise in a strategic planning meeting. In practice, it is a fundamental misreading of how sports fandom actually develops. Every dominant athlete in every successful league has started as someone's first reason to pay attention and then become a gateway to the broader sport. You don't lose those fans when the individual player exits, you keep them because by then they've fallen in love with the game itself. The WNBA should want as many Clark First fans as possible because Clark First fans become WNBA fans.
The data already supports this. The second theory is more uncomfortable to talk about, but Brennan's sources raised it directly. There is reportedly genuine unease within some portions of the league's hierarchy about the demographic makeup of the new fan base that Clark has attracted. The new viewers, the new ticket buyers, the people who were not previously engaged with women's basketball and are now showing up in significant numbers. Some people within the organization, according to Brennan, are looking at those new fans with something closer to suspicion than welcome, concerned that they don't fit a particular profile, that their presence changes the culture and community that the WNBA has built over its history. This is a real conversation that is reportedly happening inside a professional sports organization, about fans, about whether new fans are the right kind of fans, about explosive growth is actually desirable if the people driving that growth are new to the product. It is the most self-defeating possible response to success, and it explains why the behavior has been so difficult to understand from the outside, because it isn't commercially rational, it's cultural, it's political, it's about who controls the narrative of women's basketball and what that narrative is allowed to look like. Brennan's sources described it this way: instead of viewing new followers as a developmental opportunity, they are being looked at with distrust. People who have spent years fighting for this league's survival apparently are uncomfortable with the version of the league that's currently winning. This is a story as old as disruption itself. Think about the music industry's initial war against streaming. They spent years fighting technology that was giving more people access to more music because it threatened the existing infrastructure of how music was sold and who controlled those sales. They lost that fight, and the industry survived, and now streaming is the industry. The executives who spent years trying to hold back that tide didn't protect music, they just delayed the inevitable and made themselves look foolish in the process.
Think about traditional taxi companies and their response to ride-sharing. Massive lobbying efforts, legal challenges, PR campaigns, attempts to regulate the competition out of existence. They lost. The market changed. The people who adapted thrived. The people who dug in and resisted found themselves on the wrong side of a shift that was always going to happen. The WNBA is at that crossroads right now. The wave is here. It showed up wearing number 22 and pulling up from 35 feet and rewriting record books that had stood for decades. The question isn't whether the wave exists. It clearly does. The question is whether the league decides to ride it or fight it. In the middle of all of this, the leaked messages, the baseless investigation, the officiating conversations, the PR strategies, and the denials, a few people did something that deserves to be highlighted because it wasn't easy and it wasn't required. Natalie Achane, the head coach of the Golden State Valkyries, had just watched his team get beaten by 35 points. He walked off that floor on the short end of one of the most dominant individual performances in recent WNBA history. There was no incentive for him to stand up and defend the atmosphere in Indiana's arena. There was no incentive for him to praise the player who had just humiliated his team. He could have stayed quiet. He could have said no comment. He could have let the investigation run its course without ever weighing in. Instead, he went on record. Nothing racial, nothing that crossed any line. A loud, enthusiastic, completely normal basketball environment. He said what he witnessed, even when saying it helped the competition. That kind of honesty is rarer than it should be, and it mattered here. Aaliyah Boston, the Fever's former #1 overall pick, had a different kind of temptation to manage. When a transcendent talent arrives and immediately becomes the face of your franchise, the spotlight shifts. The player who was previously the centerpiece of the story becomes a supporting character. That's not an easy adjustment for any elite competitor. Boston could have been quietly distant. She could have let the narrative run that Clark's presence was a complication. Instead, when asked about the alleged agenda being described in Brennan's reporting, Boston called it disappointing. 2 words, clean and honest and exactly right.
And then there's Clark herself, who has navigated all of this. The investigation, the physicality, the officiating inconsistencies, the whispered narratives, and the league's quiet machinery working against her story, with a composure that is genuinely striking for a 23-year-old in her second professional season. "I'm just focused on basketball," she said. "I have no control over anything other than how I play and interact with others." It is exactly the right answer. It's also, in its own quiet way, a form of discipline that's harder to maintain than it looks. When the institution that is supposed to support your career is apparently working to limit your impact, the easy thing would be to say so. The visible thing would be to react. Clark hasn't. She plays, she produces, she breaks records, and she lets everyone else chase the smoke. Brennan's reporting contains one more element that escalates everything, a detail that makes the stakes of this situation concrete in a way that's hard to ignore. Sources told Brennan that conversations have already begun about potentially changing the plans for this summer's All-Star Game, which is scheduled to take place in Indianapolis, Clark's home court, the Fever's arena, the city that has become the symbolic center of this entire cultural moment in women's basketball. The suggestion, apparently driven in part by the controversy surrounding the investigation, is that the event might need to be reconsidered. The All-Star Game in Indianapolis potentially disrupted because of an investigation that has no evidence, no timeline, and no legitimate foundation beyond a collection of social media posts that not a single person present at the game can corroborate. If that happens, if the WNBA reroutes or reschedules or in any way diminishes its marquee midsummer event because of a controversy it manufactured itself, it will be one of the most spectacular acts of organizational self-sabotage in the history of professional sports. But it fits the pattern. All of it fits the pattern. A league that has spent decades fighting for survival, fighting for broadcast deals, fighting for attendance, fighting for respect and relevance and financial sustainability, has arrived at the moment where all of those fights are starting to pay off. The audience is here, the money is here, the mainstream attention is here, and some people within that league apparently cannot accept what the success actually looks like because it arrived in a form they didn't control and didn't predict and don't fully understand.
This is bigger than Caitlin Clark. The debate over Clark's impact and the league's response to her has exposed something that was always lurking beneath the surface: a tension between what women's basketball was and what it is becoming, between the small, controlled, devoted community that carried the WNBA through its hardest years and the massive, mainstream, unpredictable audience that's flooding in now. Both of those groups love the game. Both of them want the league to succeed. The question is whether the people running the organization can figure out how to hold both at the same time, or whether they'll keep pulling on the emergency brake while the train is finally moving. Caitlin Clark didn't cause this tension, she revealed it. Because the best players always do. They accelerate everything, including the contradictions that institutions spend years pretending don't exist. The WNBA has a decision to make. It can acknowledge what Brennan's sources have described, examine its own internal communications and strategy, and make genuine changes to how it responds to its greatest asset. Or it can continue denying everything, waiting for the news cycle to move on, managing the narrative, and hoping that the wave eventually recedes. The wave isn't receding. Caitlin Clark dropped a triple-double and shattered 11 records on a Tuesday in the regular season. She's 23 years old and in her second professional season. She's addressed the criticisms of her defense, improved her efficiency, expanded her game in every measurable direction. She is not close to her ceiling, and if anything, the resistance she's encountered has made her sharper, more focused, and more determined. The executives who tried to slow this down will eventually have to watch her do it anyway. The only question is whether they're still around to see it, or whether they're remembered as the people who tried to hold back one of the most significant figures in history of women's sports. History has a way of making that kind of judgment feel very final.
Think about what it means that a league had to choose between celebrating its best player and protecting its own politics, and apparently chose the politics. Think about what that says about the state of professional women's sports in this country. Think about what it means for every young athlete who grew up watching Clark in college and is now watching what happens to athletes who become too big to ignore. And ask yourself, in 5 years, when the full story of this era of women's basketball is written, will the people who tried to suppress it be proud of the role they played? The answer to that question might be the most important thing the WNBA figures out before it's too late.